Chapter 14, The Application of Intelligences. In April of 1980, I visited the Suzuki Talent Education Center in Matsumoto, Japan. There I met with individuals who administered the program and attended a concert by youngsters enrolled in the various classes at the center. The performances were virtually incredible. Children as young as 7 or 8 were playing movements from violin concerti drawn from the concert repertoire. A pre-adolescent played a virtuoso piece of the Romantic era. Children hardly old enough to hold a violin performed in startling unison, a number of pieces that any Western schoolchild would be proud to have mastered. The youngsters performed with style, gusto, and accuracy, clearly enjoying themselves and clearly giving satisfaction to the audience, largely mothers of the performers who were leaning eagerly forward lest they miss a single bowing. Indeed, the only individual who seemed discomfited was a talented cellist of perhaps 11, whose performance was being vigorously, though not unkindly, criticized by a visiting master cellist from Europe. Clearly, if I had simply heard one of the Suzuki preschoolers play an instrument while he remained hidden behind a curtain, I would have thought the performance to be by a much older child. Indeed, I would probably have concluded that the child was a prodigy or a fraud if I had been told that he was only 3 or 4 years of age. And in using the term prodigy, I would probably have been attributing to the luck of heredity what is actually a talent, nurtured through a shrewd educational intervention. On the other hand, I think it would be equally mistaken to infer that genetic factors have been invariably absent in other examples of early musical precocity. Had I the opportunity to listen to the youthful Mozart, or to an autistic child who is able to sing hundreds of melodies, I would in all likelihood have been witnessing the fruition of a strong hereditary inclination. I have taken some pains in this book to avoid pitting genetics against cultural factors. Social scientists need a framework that, while taking into account genetic predisposition and neurobiological factors, recognizes the formative role played by the environment. Even if the individuals enrolled in the Suzuki class are to some extent a selected group, the scions of musically gifted families, they clearly reach such heights of performance at a youthful age because of the ingenuity of the program and the dedication displayed by their parents. More on that later. In this chapter, I shall be concerned with the ways in which the theory of multiple intelligences may help us to understand better the reasons for the effectiveness, or the ineffectiveness, of various programs designed to help individuals realize their potential. And in conclusion, drawing on the framework introduced in Chapter 13, I will set forth some principles that may help planners and policymakers think through more effectively the goals and the means of various contemplated interventions. As compared with 100 or even with 30 years ago, talk about the development of intelligence, the realization of human potential, and the role of education is very much in the international air. These topics are being explored not only by the usual lobbying groups, but also by such unexpected and unexpectedly formidable institutions as banks for economic development and national governments. Rightly or wrongly, the powers that be in the worlds of international development and national sovereignty have become convinced that the ingredients for human progress, success, and happiness are closely linked to better educational opportunities for their client citizenry and particularly for young individuals. This provides, to my mind, a rare opportunity for the psychological and the pedagogical sciences to show that they have some usefulness. If this opportunity is not exploited, it is unlikely to present itself again for some time. Judiciously but clearly audibly, an organization like the World Bank questions a policy of exclusive funding for agriculture and technological enterprises and instead calls for investment in human development and education. Robert S. McNamara, then president of the World Bank, declared in a 1980 speech, "Development is clearly not economic progress measured in terms of gross national product. It is something much more basic. It is essentially human development. That is the individual's realization of his or her inherent potential." He went on to note that human development, which he defined as better education, health, nutrition, and family planning at the local level, promotes economic growth as effectively as does capital investment in physical plans. In Learning to Be, the prestigious UNESCO report of 1972, Edgar Faure, former Prime Minister of France, and his colleagues made the provocative statement that The human brain has a very large unused potential, which some authorities, more or less arbitrarily, have assessed at 90%. The job of education, to realize this unused potential. Consistent with these sentiments, the international think tank, the Club of Rome, commissioned a report on how education and learning might assume their proper roles in the world of today and tomorrow. As the president of the club, Aurelio Peche declared, "Any solutions to the human gap as well as any guarantees for the human future can be sought nowhere else but within ourselves. What is needed is for all of us to learn how to stir up our dormant potential and use it from now on purposefully and intelligently." The authors of the resulting volume, No Limits to Learning, concurred that, for all practical purposes, there appear to be virtually no limits to learning. As their chosen vehicle for bridging the various gaps and solving the vexing problems that plague contemporary societies, they recommended innovative learning, a second-order learning in which individuals plan in concert for the kind of world that is likely to evolve in the future and take joint actions to exploit opportunities and avoid disasters. As they describe it, innovative learning is problem formulation and clustering. Its main attributes are integration, synthesis, and the broadening of horizons. It operates in open situations or open systems. Its meaning derives from dissonance among contexts. It leads to critical questioning of conventional assumptions behind traditional thoughts and actions, focusing on necessary changes. Its values are not constant but rather shifting. Innovative learning advances our thinking by reconstructing wholes, not by fragmenting reality. The tone of this passage reflects accurately the flavor of the study as a whole. Laudable in its aspirations and hortatory in its exposition, the Club of Rome report invokes a capacity that would clearly be of greatest utility to develop both in individuals and in collectivities. The problem with the report, however, is that it contains little in the way of concrete suggestions about how anticipatory learning might be inculcated, and equally little about possible biological and cultural constraints on adopting such an enlightened, unselfish, and forward-looking orientation toward particular problems. The report remains mired at the level of slogans. Far less circumspect is the astonishing platform on which stands Luis Alberto Machado, a Venezuelan politician, the first, and so far as can be ascertained, the only minister in the world for the development of human intelligence. Surveying the world's philosophical thinkers and the range of human sciences, Minister Machado has reached the conclusion that every human being has the potential to become intelligent. Consider some of his statements. "We all have the same potentialities which throughout life are incarnated in different ways according to each person's existence. Man is offered unlimited possibilities that are materialized through learning and teaching. Einstein learned intelligence in the same way that a person learns to play the piano, by ear. Government should be, then, the teaching of intelligence. The development of man's intelligence allows him to rationally direct the biological evolution of his own species and to eradicate chance and need from the entire process of that evolution. The free intelligence of every man is also the image and likeness of God's intelligence." Based on this optimistic analysis of the capacity of human beings to become geniuses, in Machado's phrase, he and his colleagues have embarked on an ambitious program to raise the intelligence of the Venezuelan populace. "We Venezuelans are going to completely transform our educational system. We are going to teach how to develop intelligence every day, from kindergarten to college. And we are going to teach parents, especially mothers, how to teach their children from the moment of their birth, and even before, how to develop all of their capabilities. In this manner, we will be offering our people and all the peoples of the world a real new future." With the collaboration of scientists from all over the world, but chiefly from the West, the Machado Project features 14 separate programs, initially developed elsewhere, which are now being injected into Venezuelan contexts, ranging from the nursery and the elementary school to the work setting and the military. The grandiosity of the Machado Project is there for all to see, and is perhaps too inviting a target for cynical observers of the world scene. It would be easy to take potshots at this overly ambitious and perhaps somewhat ill-conceived undertaking, and to show why it is unlikely to succeed in its avowed terms. After all, we really know little about what intelligence is or what intelligences are, about how such capacities can be better developed, and about how to implant into an alien setting a set of skills that evolved under one set of historical and cultural circumstances. The same kind of critique could be initiated with equal facility with reference to other contemporary grandiose programs, such as those launched by the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential in Philadelphia. This eccentric organization claims to be able to teach the whole range of school skills to toddlers, even to those who have suffered brain damage, and it blithely contends in its workbook of cardinal facts that our genetic potential is that of Leonardo, Shakespeare, Mozart, Michelangelo, Edison, and Einstein. Unfortunately, however, this organization has not, to my knowledge, allowed objective evaluators to assess the success of its interventions. But such hatchet jobs are more likely to give momentary pleasure to the wielder of the axe than genuine profit to practitioners earnestly trying to better the skills and the knowledge base of growing human populations. The obligation of the pragmatically oriented social scientist is to offer a better set of tools and to suggest how, when adopted, these would be more likely to culminate in positive results, less likely to engender another set of dashed expectations. In what follows, I undertake some modest efforts in this direction. Attempts to think about human intelligence should begin with a confrontation of what the human species is like, and with a consideration of the spheres in which its members are inclined to perform effectively, given adequate resources and timely interventions. From these perspectives, invocations of no limits to learning are of little utility. Not only is it false to think that a human being can do anything, but where everything is possible, there are no guidelines about what ought to be attempted and what not. My 7 core forms of intelligence are an effort to lay out 7 intellectual regions in which most human beings have the potential for solid advancement, and to suggest some of the milestones that will be passed as these intellectual competences are realized by gifted individuals and by individuals who, though entirely normal, apparently possess no special gifts in a given realm. We have seen, however, that, except perhaps in the case of certain exceptional individuals, these intellectual competences never develop in a vacuum. Rather, they become mobilized by symbolizing activities in ongoing cultures where they have practical meaning and tangible consequences. Thus, the inborn capacity to process certain linguistic sounds in certain ways becomes exploited for human communication through speaking, and in many contexts, through writing. Ultimately, these nurtured abilities become central in certain social roles, ranging from the lawyer or the poet in contemporary Western civilization to an oral storyteller, shaman, or political leader in a traditional society. A lengthy educational process is necessary before the raw intellectual potential, be it linguistic, musical, or logical mathematical, can be realized in the form of a mature cultural role. Part of this process simply involves certain natural processes of development, whereby a capacity passes through a predictable set of stages as it matures and is differentiated. I have noted some of the developmental milestones that occur in the area of language, and could provide similar portraits of stream-like development in other intellectual realms. But when it comes to the transmission of specific skills and knowledge, one beholds a more complex, less natural process at work. I made an initial effort in the previous chapter to analyze this process of transmission by noting the kind of knowledge that is to be transmitted, the agents of transmission, the modes or media by which the knowledge is to be transmitted, and the locus of transmission. To my mind, an analogous analysis ought to be conducted whenever a policymaker recommends that some educational course be followed. Through such an analysis, it becomes evident that human intellectual competences can be mobilized in a variety of ways. As I have already noted, human linguistic competence can become the method whereby some other non-linguistic skill is acquired. Language is often exploited as an aid in teaching an individual some bodily process, like a dance, or some mathematical process, like a proof. Language itself can constitute a subject matter, as, for instance, when an individual is learning his own language or another tongue, or is mastering a subject matter that is in itself highly linguistic in content, like history or political science. Finally, developmental factors surrounding linguistic competence are also relevant. If, for example, individuals exhibit the highest aptitude for learning language during the first 10 years of life, and a diminished ability to do so after the second decade, and if furthermore young children are especially able to master materials through rote learning of associations, then these facts too must enter any equation describing the transmission of knowledge. This brief aside indicates, I hope, that the adoption of a perspective like MI theory may permit a more differentiated and precise analysis of how various educational goals might be viewed and pursued. It should be pointed out once again that even if one's cognitive mechanisms are in order, educational progress will not necessarily result. Most contemporary psychological analyses assume an individual eager to learn, but in fact, such factors as proper motivation, an effective state conducive to learning, a set of values that favors a particular kind of learning, and a supporting cultural context are indispensable, though often elusive factors in the educational process. Indeed, one of the Venezuelan supported research projects has concluded that proper motivation to learn may well be the single biggest difference between a successful and an unsuccessful educational program and learner. Be that as it may, analysis of educational experiments must attend to such factors as motivation, personality, and value. The fact that my own analysis focuses heavily on purely cognitive components must be considered a limitation of the present formulation. Returning to the opening example, it should be possible and certainly desirable to explain something of the success of the Suzuki music program through our framework of human intelligences. Before doing so, it is helpful to provide some more information about this unusual and unusually effective experiment. For these details, I draw upon my observations at Matsumoto and on my own experiences as a Suzuki parent, as well as on the valuable study of the Suzuki program, undertaken by Lois Tanucci at Harvard. The Talent Education Program, devised just before World War II by a sensitive Japanese violinist named Shinichi Suzuki, is a carefully structured technique of music education that begins virtually at birth and has as a principal goal the training of accomplished musical performance in young children. Crucial to success in the program is the child's mother, who, particularly at the beginning, is the locus of the program and remains throughout a vital catalyst for child involvement and progress. In a typical version of the program, as perfected in Japan and recently adopted in other countries, the child is exposed daily during the first year of life to recordings of great performances. Toward the end of the first year of life, the child begins to hear, on a fairly regular basis, the 20 short songs that will constitute his curriculum once he begins to study an instrument. 6 months before beginning his own lessons, at perhaps the age of 2, the child starts to attend group lessons. These lessons, which last perhaps an hour and a half, bring together children of different ages and levels of performance, covering a total age span of perhaps 2 or 3 years. The children attend with their mothers, who participate with the children and the teacher in a group of games and exercises. The lessons themselves are divided between general exercises in which all children participate and from which all children are expected to benefit, and short performances by each of the students of the pieces on which they have been working. The future student listens attentively and participates to the extent that he can. At these lessons, he has an opportunity to observe what he will be doing in his own lessons once they have begun. The emphasis always falls on one's own progress from one week to the next, never on competition with the other children. Meanwhile, back at home, the child's own interest in playing is being deliberately aroused. The mother has received a small violin of the same size that the child himself will one day play, and begins to perform by herself each day. If she does not know how to play the violin, she takes lessons of the same sort that her child will soon be taking. The child watches with mounting excitement, and finally one day the mother allows the child to touch the instrument himself. This is a thrilling moment. Shortly thereafter, when mother and teacher decide that the child's interest has reached a fever pitch, the child is invited to join the group he has been observing and is given an individual lesson on his own instrument. Another milestone has been passed. The mother and child then go home and work very hard on the lesson in order to surprise the teacher with the youngster's progress during the week interval. Over the next months, mother and child lessons and practice continue together. Gradually, the mother's involvement as an active student and fiddler stops, and the attention focuses completely on the child. Over the next years, the child follows faithfully a curriculum that has been worked out with painstaking care by Suzuki and his colleagues. The agents, loci, and media of transmission are all specified in the program. Each step in the curriculum is carefully structured so that it advances the child but does not cause him frustration or undue difficulty. Correct performance is constantly modeled through recordings and through the mother's and the teacher's own examples. The child does not proceed to a new lesson or piece until he has thoroughly mastered the previous one, and he returns repeatedly to old pieces to make sure that the models and the lessons have been retained. Much is made of repetition and practice, and the child strives to duplicate exactly the sounds heard on the recording. This makes for impressive group performances, though it does not generate interesting variations in performance. Perhaps these facts explain why the cello student I witnessed could not readily deal with the vigorous criticism offered by the non-Suzuki master. An avowed goal of the program is to produce appealing sounds, and children are often asked explicitly to make a piece sound beautiful. In Suzuki's classes for advanced students, one of the most difficult challenges is total mastery of a single note. In Zen fashion, students are asked to practice a note up to 1,000 times a week until they come to understand how it feels to play a tone perfectly. Over the next few years, the child continues this daily regimen of practice, together with weekly individual and group lessons. Naturally, children will progress at different rates, but even the less remarkable pupils will perform at a level that astonishes Western observers. One of 30 students beginning at age 2 or 3 will be able to play a Vivaldi concerto at age 6 and a Mozart 1 by 9 or 10, and even the average student will have reached this competence but a few years later. In sharp contrast to the Western context, children do not have to be cajoled or wheedled into practicing. In fact, it is the child who comes to request the practicing time. If the child does not want to practice, the mother is considered to be at fault, and she is counseled on how to restore motivation and initiative to the child. It is worth emphasizing that the goal of producing outstanding performances, which may seem all-encompassing to outside observers, is in fact not Suzuki's avowed aim. He is interested rather in forming an individual with a strong, positive, and attractive character, and regards exquisite musical performance as simply a means to that end, a means that could be achieved by any intensive artistic experience. For this reason, it is not particularly relevant that many of the Suzuki students stop playing their instruments when they become adolescents. However, it is worth noting that approximately 5% of Suzuki children do go on to become professional musicians, and that the percentage of Suzuki students is rising in major Western conservatories, such as the Juilliard School of Music. How can we make sense of this amazing experiment in terms of the framework of intellectual competences? Certainly pivotal from this perspective is the fact that Suzuki has focused on one of the intelligences, that of music, and has helped individuals of a presumably wide range of native talents advance rapidly within that domain. Indeed, it is hardly an exaggeration to say that thanks to Suzuki's ingenious program, the kind of domain proficiency that David Feldman has discerned in child prodigies has been made available to a much wider population. The success of the program is integrally tied, in my judgment, to an intuitive understanding of the natural milestones of musical development in a young child, and of the manner in which, through pieces that pose successively just the right amount of difficulty, these milestones might be most effectively and most smoothly negotiated. Yet the effectiveness of this program depends on more than a shrewd sense of how musical abilities may unfold. To my mind, Suzuki has performed a superbly keen analysis of a whole range of factors, from the agents of transmission to the kinds of intelligence, that are relevant to the attainment of skilled performances. As a start, he has realized the special importance and heightened sensitivity of the early years of life. Not only does formal instruction begin at the age of 3 or so, but the groundwork has been carefully laid in the opening years of life through ample exposure to the materials that will eventually be learned. Musical pieces are as much in the air as the child's native language, to the extent that there may be a critical period for the acquisition of musical competence, and to the extent that the brain of the young child is especially plastic for this kind of learning. Suzuki has certainly taken advantage of important neurobiological factors. Second, and perhaps more important, Suzuki has brilliantly exploited the mother-child relationship, making it central to the initial acquisition of motivation and competence in violin playing. Through his sensitivity to interpersonal knowledge, the mother's knowledge of her child and the child's knowledge of his mother, and his appreciation of the strong affective bonds that define this mother-child relationship, Suzuki has succeeded in fostering a tremendous commitment on the part of both individuals to the child's mastery of the violin. The instrument becomes a privileged means of maintaining intimacy between child and parent. Nor should the role of other children be minimized. The fact that so much of Suzuki instruction and performance takes place in a learning context, rich in other children, exploits a youngster's tendency to imitate the behavior of peers in his vicinity. If one had to reduce the complex Suzuki method to a formula, one might speak of strong interpersonal knowledge being used as a means to negotiate a complex musical pathway, in the context of a great deal of cultural support for such an undertaking. It is no accident that a program clearly built upon the mother's total involvement with her child and taking advantage of the support of other individuals as well was devised in Japan. All regimens have their costs, and some equivocal aspects of the Suzuki method should also be noted. The method is very much oriented toward learning by ear. Probably a highly beneficent decision, considering the age of the children who are enrolled. Much time would be wasted in trying to get preschoolers to read notation, and the insistence in many quarters on beginning with the score often makes many otherwise musically inclined children hostile to their music lessons. However, because the learning of notation is devalued in the Suzuki method, children often fail to master sight reading. Shifting to a notation-based strategy after the ages of 6 or 7 would seem to be a desirable ploy if the habits acquired by ear and hand have not become too completely entrenched by this time. The very plasticity that initially allowed rapid learning may already have given way to a rigid and difficult-to-alter style of performance. A more serious charge against the Suzuki method pertains to the limited character of the musical skills and knowledge it develops. For one thing, the music played is exclusively Western music from the Baroque through the Romantic periods. A circumscribed sample of Western music, and an even smaller proportion of the world's repertoire. Yet, again, because the children are so deeply immersed in or imprinted upon this common idiom during the most formative and critical years of their musical training, the Suzuki program may engender an unnecessarily parochial taste. Much of the method focuses on a slavish and uncritical imitation of a certain interpretation of the music. For example, a Fritz Kreisler recording of a classical sonata. Children are likely to come away with the notion that there is but one correct way to interpret a piece of music, rather than there being a range of equally plausible interpretations. Even more problematically, children receive the impression that the important thing in music is to replicate a sound as it has been heard and not to attempt to change it in any way. No wonder that few, if any, Suzuki-trained children display any inclination toward composing. The whole notion of doing it another way, of decomposing a piece into one's own preferred variations, is bypassed in such a highly mimetic form of learning. In this case, a single mode of transmission may exact severe costs. Finally, there are definite personal costs to this undertaking. From the point of view of the child, he is devoting many hours each week to a single kind of pursuit and to the development of a single intelligence, at the cost of stimulating and developing other intellectual streams. More dramatically, this regimen makes great demands upon the mother. She is expected to devote herself unstintingly to the development in her child of a certain capacity. If she succeeds, plaudits are likely to come to the child. If she fails, she will probably be blamed. A mother once complained to Suzuki that teaching her child took up too much of her time. He immediately responded, "Then why did you bear him?" Finally, whether or not the child ultimately succeeds in musical mastery, he will eventually leave the home. Meanwhile, the mother's own personal skills and qualities may not have been significantly enhanced, a result that, at least to Western eyes, is lamentable. These deficits are perhaps minor in comparison with the pleasures of skilled playing that the Suzuki method has given to many individuals, including mothers. Nonetheless, it is worth considering which alterations could minimize these deficiencies while still preserving the key points of the method. According to my analysis, there is no reason for the children not to acquire a wider repertoire, and little reason for them not to attain high levels of competence in the notational realm. The media available to the child could certainly be broadened. More problematic is the tension between ideal production of someone else's model and the production of one's own pieces of music in one's own way. The transition from skilled performance to original composition is difficult to make in any case, and my own guess is that the Suzuki method makes it nearly impossible. As for the interpersonal costs, they also seem intrinsic to the program. In societies where mothers do not invest themselves so completely, the Suzuki program is not nearly so successful and, in fact, comes to resemble standard musical training. The Suzuki focus on music is probably apt, because an individual can advance quite far in that intellectual domain without needing much general knowledge about the world. However, as I have indicated, the choice of the musical domain is not particularly decisive as far as Suzuki himself is concerned. Other arts from flower arrangement to painting could yield many of the same traits of character, particularly if pursued with the same rigor, vigor, and faith. There is a preschool and kindergarten in Matsumoto where a much wider set of curricular materials is used, apparently with marked success. And in Japan today, the potential of preschool children to master a range of tasks, including reading, mathematics, and writing, is estimated to be quite high, even in comparison with child-centered middle-class America. The founder of Sony, Masaru Ibuka, has even written a bestseller, Kindergarten is Too Late, which articulates the profound belief among Japanese in the primacy of the first quinquennium of life. Success has 1,000 fathers, and the phenomenal success of Japan in the era after World War II naturally has produced numerous candidates for the prime cause. There seems to be little question that the Japanese are skilled at studying examples in other lands and then absorbing the best from other individuals and groups. The Japanese also have a strong dedication to discipline, education, and technological expertise. And each of these ends has been pursued to a high point during the past 30 years. Indeed, this success has invaded practically every domain. Japanese youth today are significantly taller and have significantly higher IQs than their counterparts of 30 years ago. The strongest proof, if proof be needed, that early educational and nutritional experiences can make an enormous difference. Yet sheer imitation is not enough, for the impulse to imitate the West has been found in many developing countries that have not in any way matched the Japanese success story. From all indications, the ability to learn from other cultures has also been matched by a capacity to maintain what is suitable and distinctive in the Japanese cultural tradition. According to my own analysis, and to that of colleagues on the project on human potential, the Japanese have succeeded in striking an effective balance between the maintenance of group feeling and solidarity, on the one hand, and individual attainment of proficiency and skill, on the other. Both forms of personal intelligence seem to be exploited here. This balance can be seen at a variety of levels of achievement. For example, in primary school classes, individuals are expected to learn arithmetic. In most parts of the world, elementary arithmetic is taught principally through rote learning, with little attention to the underlying concepts, which often perplex not only the youngsters but also the teachers. In Japan, however, according to recent reports by Jack and Elizabeth Easley, challenging problems are posed to entire classes, whose members then have the opportunity to work together over several days in an effort to solve these problems. The children are encouraged to talk to and to help one another, and are allowed to make mistakes. At times, older children visit the classrooms and aid the younger ones. Thus, what is potentially a tension-building and frustrating situation is alleviated through the involvement of children in a common effort to understand. There is plenty of support for the general collaborative effort, accompanied by a feeling that it is all right not to come up with an answer right away, so long as one keeps plugging away at the problems. Paradoxically, in our much more overtly competitive society, this risk of not knowing the answer at the end of the class seems too great. Neither teacher nor student can readily handle the tension, and so a potentially valuable learning opportunity is scuttled. Even in Japan's large business corporations, one encounters the same delicate balance. Much of the competitive urge, of course, is deflected to competition with other societies, where Japan has enjoyed great success, and toward anticipating future trends in the market, where again, Japan has displayed far more foresight than have its principal competitors. Moreover, within the Japanese company itself, it is proper for different individuals to make different contributions to problem formulation and problem solution. An individual identifies strongly with his firm, with which he expects to have lifelong relations, and has relatively little sense of being in direct competition with fellow employees. Similarly, no premium is placed on a single individual's, particularly a single young individual, possessing all the requisite competences himself. If anything, such a precocious polymath could be deemed inappropriate and somewhat anachronistic. Thus, we might even say that the Japanese corporation has realized, in an intuitive way, that there is a profile of human intelligences, and that individuals with different profiles can make their own distinctive contributions to the success of the firm. As with the Suzuki Talent Education Program, there are costs to the Japanese corporate system. And as the success has become better known, these costs have also become more evident. The opportunity to work in the corporation rests upon success in the academic system. And this success, in turn, depends heavily on the peculiarities and particularities of the Japanese child-rearing and educational systems. An early key to a child's eventual success is believed to lie in the relationship of the young child, particularly the boy, to his mother. While the strong bond can help to yield early achievements, it can also exert negative effects as children feel ensnared in a bargain with their mother to achieve. If they fail to do so, there may be severe frustration, tension, and even overt aggression against the mother. The public school system attempts to maintain a friendly and cooperative spirit among students, but this communal conviviality overlooks the reality that there are far fewer places in the university than there are youths intent on occupying them. Hence the propagation of the alternative school, or juku, where youths are trained to do well on their college entry examinations. From all reports, the atmosphere in the jukus is much more frankly competitive. And again, one encounters severe psychological costs, and sometimes suicides, among those youths who do not perform satisfactorily on the examinations. Finally, the skill of the Japanese at absorbing appropriate models from other settings is now seen to have its limits as the models from elsewhere grow less relevant, and as the Japanese are thrown more on their own innovative powers. Many Japanese commentators have decried the dearth of original scientists from this interpersonally oriented culture, and have noted with even greater sadness that the Japanese scientists and artists whose originality turns out to be the most prized are those who have moved to the West. I have dwelled at some length on Japan because in today's world, the Japanese example is particularly striking, and because I feel that the analytic framework developed here ought to be applied in the first instance to educational experiments that have been successful. It is crucial to note, however, that Japanese success with a program like talent education does not simply reflect expert design. Were that the case, then the Suzuki program would prove equally successful everywhere and in every field of learning, as is decidedly not the case. No, the key to the success of the Suzuki program in Japan lies in the comfortable fit between the abilities and inclinations of the target population, young children, and the particular values, opportunities, and institutions of the society in which they happen to be growing up. Such programs can be successfully exported only if similar support systems exist in the new host country, or alternatively, if suitable alterations are made so that the educational program meshes with the dominant values, procedures, and intellectual orientation of the host land. Here, indeed, may lie some clues to the success of other educational interventions as well. In the case of teaching the fundamentals of literacy, for example, two notable successes of recent years have both taken shrewd advantage of the situations as they exist in particular host countries. One such case is Paulo Freire's efforts to teach reading to illiterate adult Brazilian peasants. Freire has developed a method in which individuals are introduced to key words that have strong personal value and feature a phonetic and morphological structure relevant to the learning of future words. This much is skillful linguistic pedagogy. But the Freire program is embedded within a much larger program of political action, which has profound meaning for students and helps to spur them on to heroic efforts. Here, the context of learning makes a critical difference. A totally different but also highly successful approach to reading instruction can be found in the television programs Sesame Street and The Electric Company, which have taught the fundamentals of reading to a generation of American schoolchildren. Once again, these procedures build on tried-and-true methods of training reading, but through a commercial-style format, as well as a tempo suited to the medium of television, these programs succeed in holding the audience's attention. In both the Brazilian and the American cases, attempts have been made to transplant the reading programs to very different populations. My own guess is that these efforts will be successful to the extent that the particular conditions that obtained in the countries of origin can also be encountered or constructed in novel cultural settings. In my terms, an analysis in terms of the intellectual skills to be cultivated and of those already valued in the host society should precede any contemplated intervention. Alas, the incidence of educational experiments that have not succeeded is high in the contemporary world. One need only think of the attempts in Iran to westernize the educational system during the last 30 years, or of the various flirtations in the People's Republic of China with a technologically oriented education. In each case, attempts were made to impose a more Western-style curriculum, one organized around scientific thinking, upon a society that had previously favored traditional modes of schooling of the sort considered in the previous chapter. Tremendous stress resulted when schools that had been largely concerned with teaching one form of literacy were asked to convey open thinking, the weighing of conflicting theories and the primacy of logical mathematical reasoning. The relative de-emphasis of social ties, the dramatic shift in the uses to which language was put, and the insistence on the application of logical mathematical thinking to diverse realms of existence proved too jarring in these entrenched cultural contexts. Not surprisingly, in both the Iranian and the Chinese cases, a dramatic counter-reaction resulted. A reflexive opposition to everything Western, modern, and technological characterized the Cultural Revolution in China as well as the Islamic revival in Iran. Clearly, in the absence of continuity with the past, an educational innovation is unlikely to hold. Such a review of pedagogical experiments, successful or not, calls upon a close analysis of educational processes as they have traditionally existed in a culture, as well as on a careful consideration of how these processes might be mobilized to meet novel needs in a changing world. I am frankly somewhat uncomfortable, as a neophyte in matters of policy, in recommending a particular course of action in situations that are exceedingly complex and ever fluid. Nonetheless, it seems opportune at this concluding point to mention some of the considerations that policymakers might bear in mind as they attempt to decide about the education and, in a sense, the future lives of those individuals over whom they have responsibility. It is always judicious to begin with a review of the goals of a particular intervention or of a whole educational program. The more specifically these goals can be articulated, the more shorn of rhetoric or generalities, the better. Thus, educating individuals to achieve their potential or to be an informed citizenry is not helpful. But achieving sufficient literacy to read a newspaper or discuss a current political problem is instructively precise. For the latter type of specific goal, one can analyze the constituent intellectual skills and devise ways of assessing success, or degrees of success or failure. For the former grandiose goal, there is no implied evaluation metric. Statement of explicit goals also brings to the fore potential conflicts or contradictions. For example, a goal of attaining a certain level of literacy, skill in scientific thinking, or facility in discussing political issues might well conflict with a goal of maintaining traditional religious values, political attitudes, or a homogeneous outlook throughout the population. Though such conflicts are unfortunate, it is better that they be confronted explicitly rather than ignored, denied, or swept under a rhetorical rug. Following the review of goals, a next step entails a sober assessment of the means currently available for achieving these goals. Some of this analysis ought to focus on the traditional methods that are available: observation learning, informal interaction, apprenticeship systems, prevalent media, varieties of school and the curriculums, explicit or implicit, that currently exist. But it is also advisable to cast the net more widely and to consider the agents and the loci of transmission, as well as the ways in which values, roles, and procedures have in fact been transmitted across generations. For every goal currently being pursued, there is presumably a set of intelligences that could readily be mobilized for its realization, as well as a set of intelligences whose mobilization would pose a greater challenge. Moreover, with different cultures, there appear to be characteristic blends of intelligences that have been favored over the years. Determining the exact blend is no easy matter, but It is possible to delineate those configurations that have been relatively prominent in diverse cultural settings. Thus, one would expect that in a traditional agrarian society, interpersonal, bodily kinesthetic, and linguistic forms of intelligence would be highlighted in informal educational settings, which are largely on-site and feature considerable observation and imitation. In a society in the early stages of industrialization, one would anticipate traditional forms of schooling that focus on rote linguistic learning, but where logical mathematical forms of intelligence are beginning to be used. In highly industrialized societies and in post-industrial society, one would predict a prizing of linguistic, logical mathematical, and intrapersonal forms of intelligence. Quite probably, modern secular schools would be yielding to individual computerized instruction. The shift from any of these forms to the next one would clearly involve costs. An attempt to shift directly from agrarian to post-industrial modes of transmission, as in the aforementioned Iranian case, could be expected to yield especially severe strains. In societies with limited resources, it may seem necessary to move directly from an inventory of goals and means to a decision about the optimal way to proceed with the population as a whole. However, it is a principal assumption of this study that individuals are not all alike in their cognitive potentials and their intellectual styles, and that education can be more properly carried out if it is tailored to the abilities and the needs of the particular individuals involved. Indeed, the cost of attempting to treat all individuals the same, or of trying to convey knowledge to individuals in ways uncongenial to their preferred modes of learning, may be great. If at all possible, it is advisable to devise methods for assessing the intellectual profiles of individuals. There does not yet exist a technology explicitly designed to test an individual's intellectual profile. I am not sure it would be wise to attempt to set up such an explicit testing program, particularly given the ways in which such testing programs tend to become standardized and commercialized. But it is clear from my analyses that certain ways of assessing individual profiles are better than others. I would now like to indicate how one might, given sufficient resources and benevolent intentions, assess an individual's profile of intelligences. A first point is that intelligences should not be assessed in the same ways at different ages. The methods used with an infant or a preschooler ought to be tailored to the particular ways of knowing that typify these individuals, and may be different from those employed with older individuals. My own belief is that one could assess an individual's intellectual potentials quite early in life, perhaps even in infancy. At that time, intellectual strengths and weaknesses would emerge most readily if individuals were given the opportunity to learn to recognize certain patterns and were tested on their capacities to remember these from one day to the next. Thus, an individual with strong abilities in the spatial realm should learn to recognize target patterns quite quickly when exposed to them, to appreciate their identity even when their arrangement in space has been altered, and to notice slight deviations from them when they are presented on subsequent trials or subsequent days. Similarly, one could assess pattern recognition abilities in other intellectual domains, like language or number, as well as the ability to learn motor patterns and to revise and transform them in adaptive ways. My own hunch about strong intellectual abilities is that an individual so blessed does not merely have an easy time learning new patterns. He, in fact, learns them so readily that it is virtually impossible for him to forget them. The simple melodies continue to play on in his mind. The sentences linger there. The spatial or gestural configurations are readily brought to the fore, although they may not have been tapped for a while. Even if such intellectual profiles could be drawn up in the first year or two of life, I have little doubt that profiles at that early date can be readily shifted. In fact, that is what early neural and functional plasticity is all about. A principal reason for early assessment is to allow an individual to proceed as rapidly as seems warranted in those intellectual channels where he is talented, even as it affords an opportunity to bolster those intellectual endowments that seem relatively modest. At a somewhat later age, all the way up through the preschool years, it should prove possible to secure a contextually rich and reliable assessment of an individual's intellectual profile. The preferred route for assessment at this age is to involve children in activities they themselves are likely to find motivating. They can then advance with little direct tutelage through the steps involved in mastering a particular problem or task. Puzzles, games, and other challenges couched in the symbol system of a single intelligence or of a pair of intelligences are particularly promising means for assessing the relevant intelligence. Involvement with such inherently engrossing materials provides an ideal opportunity to observe intelligences at work and to monitor their advances over a finite period of time. If one could watch a child as he learns to build various constructions out of blocks, one would receive insight into his skills in the areas of spatial and kinesthetic intelligence. Similarly, the child's capacities to relate a set of stories would reveal facets of his linguistic promise, even as his capacity to operate a simple machine would illuminate kinesthetic and logical mathematical skills. Such involvements in rich and provocative environments are also most likely to elicit markers, those signs of early giftedness that are readily noticed by adults expert in a particular intellectual domain. The future musician may be marked by perfect pitch, the child gifted in personal matters by his intuitions about the motives of others, the budding scientist by his ability to pose provocative questions and then follow them up with appropriate ones. Note how this approach to assessment differs from that employed in traditional intelligence testing. In the conventional test, the child is confronted by an adult who fires at him a rapid series of questions. The child is expected to give a single answer, or when somewhat older, to write down his answer or to select it from a set of choices. A premium is placed on linguistic facility, on certain logical mathematical abilities, and on a kind of social skill at negotiating the situation with an elder in one's presence. These factors can all intrude when one is trying to assess another kind of intelligence, say musical, bodily kinesthetic, or spatial. By removing the experimenter and his paraphernalia from the assessing situation, or at least by placing them firmly in the background, and by substituting the actual elements and symbols of the particular realm under consideration, it should prove possible to obtain a more veridical picture of the child's current intellectual abilities and of his intellectual potential. Proceeding from some ideas originally put forth by the Soviet psychologist Vygotsky, it should be possible to devise tests suitable for individuals who have had little or no prior experience with the particular material or symbolic elements in question, and to see how rapidly they can progress in a given area in a limited period of time. Such a mission places a particularly strong burden on the tester to locate problems that are intrinsically engaging and serve as crystallizing experiences for young and naive but possibly talented individuals. In the present study of intelligences, I have noted some of the experiences that proved catalytic for particular individuals in particular domains. Watching folk pageants for the future dancer, looking at recurrent alternating visual patterns for the young mathematician, learning long and intricate rhymes for the future poet. Naturally, the specific experiences favored for the assessment of intellectual potential will differ, given the age, the sophistication, and the cultural background of the individual. Thus, when monitoring the spatial realm, one might hide an object from the 1-year-old, pose a jigsaw puzzle to the 6-year-old, or provide the pre-adolescent with a Rubik's Cube. Analogously, in the musical realm, one might vary a lullaby for the 2-year-old, provide the 8-year-old with a computer on which he can compose simple melodies, or analyze a fugue with an adolescent. In any case, the general idea of finding intriguing puzzles and allowing children to take off with them seems to offer a far more valid way of assessing profiles of individuals than the current favorites worldwide. Standard measures designed to be given within a half hour with the aid of paper and pencil. My own guess is that it should be possible to gain a reasonably accurate picture of an individual's intellectual profile, be he 3 or 13, in the course of a month or so, while that individual is involved in regular classroom activities. The total time spent might be 5 to 10 hours of observing, a long time given current standards of intelligence testing, but a very short time in terms of the life of that student. Such a profile should indicate which lines are already launched in an individual, which lines show a decided potential for development, which are more modestly endowed or entail some genuine obstacles, such as tone deafness, meager visual imagery, or clumsiness. Now comes the decisive but delicate step in the educational planning process. Given the curricular ends that one has in mind for an individual and the individual's own intellectual profiles, a decision must be made about which educational regimen to follow. First of all, there must be a general strategic decision. Does one play from strength? Does one bolster weakness? Or does one attempt to work along both tracks at the same time? Naturally, this decision must be made in terms of the resources available, as well as of the overall goals of both the society and the individuals most directly involved. Assuming room for developing more than a single faculty along a single track, decisions of a far more focused sort must be made as well. In the case of each individual, those charged with educational planning must decide which means can best be mobilized to help that individual attain a desired competence, skill, or role. In the case of the highly talented individual, it may be necessary and sufficient to enable him to work directly with an acknowledged master in a kind of apprenticeship relation. It should also be possible to provide him with materials that he can explore and with which he can advance on his own. In the case of the individual with meager abilities or even frank pathologies, it will probably be necessary to devise special prostheses, machinery, mechanisms, or other means whereby the information or skills can be presented to him in such a way as to exploit the intellectual capacities he has, while circumventing, to as large an extent as possible, his intellectual frailties. In the case of the individual who does not fall at either extreme of the bell-shaped curve, there will presumably be a larger set of procedures and curricula from which one can draw, always acknowledging the limits of resources and the competing demands on the students' and the teacher's time. Surprisingly, little work has been done by educational psychologists in charting the general principles that may govern progress through an intellectual domain. This lack may be due in part to a lack of concern with particular domains, as opposed to general learning, in part to extensive concern with just how a specific task is mastered. Of various efforts in this direction, I find most suggestive the work by the Soviet School of Psychology. Such followers of Lev Vygotsky as V. Davidov, D. Elkinen, and A.K. Markova. These researchers believe that at each age, children exhibit a different set of interests. Thus, during infancy, the dominant activity involves emotional contact. At age 2, the child is absorbed in manipulation of objects. At ages 3 to 7, role play and other kinds of symbolic activity come to the fore. During the ages of 7 to 11, the feature activity is formal study in school. And in adolescence, the youth pursues a combination of intimate personal relations and career-oriented exploration. Any educational program should keep these biases in mind, though, of course, the specific profile of interest may differ significantly across cultures. Working within these broad parameters, the educator searches for genetic primary examples. These are problems or lessons that can be handled by the novice, but, at the same time, harbor within them the most relevant abstractions within that domain. Mastery of a genetic primary example serves as an indication that an individual can successfully negotiate the succeeding steps within the field. For the educator, the challenge consists in planning the steps, the hurdles that the child must overcome so that he can progress satisfactorily through the domain, until he reaches the next phase and the next genetic primary example. If the kind of analysis put forth by Soviet psychologists could be merged with the approach being developed here, it might be possible to chart an optimal path of educational progress in each of the intellectual domains with which I have been concerned. Such an analysis would reveal the path or the set of paths to be negotiated by normal children, as well as by those with special gifts or particular difficulties. Given a wide range of cultural goals and an even greater variety of intellectual profiles, the challenge of obtaining a match between student and method may seem overwhelming. In fact, however, students have managed to learn even when lessons are in no way tailored for them, presumably because most curricula are redundant, and because the students themselves possess an array of intellectual strengths and strategies on which they can draw. A matching system should help ensure that a student can rapidly and smoothly master what needs to be mastered, and thus be freed to proceed further along both optional and optimal paths of development. Of course, the idea of matching individuals with particular subject matters and/or styles of teaching is familiar and has implicitly guided much instruction since classical times. It is therefore disappointing to note that attempts to document significant improvements as a result of matching students with appropriate teaching techniques have not met with much success. Educational scholars nonetheless cling to the vision of the optimal match between student and material. In my own view, this tenacity is legitimate, After all, the science of educational psychology is still young, and in the wake of superior conceptualizations and finer measures, the practice of matching the individual learner's profile to the materials and modes of instruction may still be validated. Moreover, if one adopts MI theory, the options for such matches increase. As I have already noted, it is possible that the intelligences can function both as subject matters in themselves and as the preferred means for inculcating diverse subject matter. Carrying out relevant research is a task for the future. The most I can do here is to sketch some expectations. In the case of learning to program a computer, for example, it seems plausible that a number of intellectual competences may prove relevant. Logical mathematical intelligence seems central because programming depends upon the deployment of strict procedures to solve a problem or attain a goal in a finite number of steps. Writing the program requires that the steps be clear, precise, and organized in a strictly logical order. Linguistic intelligence is also relevant, at least so long as manuals and computer languages make use of ordinary language. The metaphor of the program as a story, complete with subplots, may also help certain budding programmers with a linguistic bent. The intuitions that individuals have about particular domains may well help them in learning to program. Thus, an individual with a strong musical bent might best be introduced to programming by attempting to program a simple musical piece, or to master the use of a program that composes. An individual with strong spatial abilities might be initiated through some form of computer graphics, and he might also be aided in the task of programming through the use of a flowchart or some other spatial diagram. Personal intelligences can play important roles. The extensive planning of steps and goals carried out by the individual as he engages in programming relies on intrapersonal forms of thinking, even as the cooperation needed for carrying out a complex task or for learning new computational skills may rely on an individual's ability to work with a team. Kinesthetic intelligence may play a role in working with the computer itself, facilitate skill at the terminal, and be exploited in those cases where the subject matter of a program involves use of the body. Programming a dance or a sequence of football plays. Parallel lines of reasoning can be invoked in analyzing the task of learning to read, particularly in the case of individuals who have initial difficulty in learning to read text. It may make sense to begin with an introduction to some other symbolic systems. For example, those used for musical notation, map making, or mathematics. Moreover, individuals with pronounced reading disabilities sometimes must resort to unusual measures of learning. For example, mastering the letters through tactile kinesthetic exploration. The particular subject matter may also play an important role in improving reading comprehension. An individual who knows something about a field or is interested in increasing his knowledge base may find reading easier and will also be more highly motivated to read. Whether the actual process of reading involves, in significant measure, intelligences other than linguistic ones is problematic. However, in view of the various reading systems already invented by human beings, such as pictographic systems, and the kinds likely to be devised in the future, logical mathematical systems for use with computers, it seems clear that one's facility in reading will depend on more than one's linguistic capacities. Even as computers offer a useful way to think about the marshalling of intelligences to master educational goals, the potential utility of computers in the process of matching individuals to modes of instruction is substantial. While effecting a match between a student's intellectual profile and the instructional goals can be a highly demanding task for even the most gifted instructor, the relevant kinds of information could be readily handled by a computer that can, in a fraction of a second, suggest alternative pedagogical programs or routes. More important, the computer can be a vital facilitator in the actual process of instruction, helping individuals to negotiate sequences at their preferred pace by using a variety of educational techniques. I should point out, however, that the computer cannot assume certain roles of an interpersonal sort and seems less relevant for certain intellectual domains, say kinesthetic, than for others, logical mathematical. There is the risk that the electronic computer, a product of Western thinking and technology, may prove most useful for perpetuating just those forms of intelligence that led to its devising in the first place. It is also possible, however, that extensions of the computer, including robots, might eventually be developed that would facilitate learning and mastery in the full gamut of intellectual domains. While it is desirable to consider the fine points of the learning process, it is important for the planner or policymaker not to lose sight of his overall educational agenda. Ultimately, the educational plans that are pursued need to be orchestrated across various interest groups of the society so that they can, taken together, help the society to achieve its larger goals. Individual profiles must be considered in the light of goals pursued by the wider society. And sometimes, in fact, individuals with gifts in certain directions must nonetheless be guided along other less favored paths simply because the needs of the culture are particularly urgent in that realm at that time. The synthetic ability entailed in this form of decision-making involves its own blend of intelligences, if not a special form of intelligence. It is important that a society find some way of training and then using those abilities that permit a vision of a large and complex whole. These scattered notes are as far as I feel prepared to go in trying to draw some educational and policy implications from the framework introduced in this book. The framework has been taken principally from findings in the biological and cognitive sciences, and it first needs to be amply discussed and tested in those circles before it provides a handbook, a red book, or a white paper for any practitioner. Even good ideas have been ruined by premature attempts at implementation, and we are not yet certain of the goodness of the idea of multiple intelligences. After the euphoria of the 1960s and early 1970s, when educational planners felt that they could readily ameliorate the world's ills, we have come to the painful realization that the problems dwarf our understanding, our knowledge, and our ability to act prudently. We have become much more aware of the roles of history, politics, and culture in circumscribing or thwarting our ambitious plans, and in guiding them down paths that could not have been anticipated. We are even more keenly aware that particular historical events and technological developments can mold the future in a way that would have been difficult to envision even a decade ago. For every successful planner and implementer, for every Sesame Street or Suzuki Method, there are dozens, perhaps thousands of failed plans. So many, in fact, that it is difficult to know whether the few successes are happy accidents or the fruits of rare genius. Nonetheless, problems and potentialities will not go away, and people, teachers of preschoolers no less than ministers of education, will continue to hold the major responsibility for developing other individuals. This trust they will exercise wisely or poorly, productively or counterproductively. That they should do so with some awareness of what they are doing, with some knowledge of the alternative methods and outcomes would seem to be preferable to operating completely from intuition or wholly from ideology. In this book, I have urged that educators pay close heed to the biological and psychological proclivities of human beings, and to the particular historical and cultural context of the locales where they live, a task, of course, easier said than done. Nonetheless, knowledge is accruing and will, I hope, continue to accrue about what human beings are like when considered in relative isolation and as members of a functioning cultural entity. And because some individuals will continue to assume responsibility for planning the lives of others, it seems preferable that their efforts be framed by our growing knowledge of human minds. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.